Thank you. So I am not a climate scientist. I got to Stanford 4 years ago. I've been at Google, where I helped the company set up its efforts on energy and climate change. Before that, I was in an investment firm that we set up to invest in clean energy projects. I worked in a wind company prior to that. And for 8 years, I was in the Clinton administration, and I served the last 4 years as Assistant Secretary of Energy for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. So my focus is not on climate science, but it's on what it's going to take in terms of technologies, policy, and finance to get us to a point where we actually can address climate in a cost-effective way that gets us as close as possible to this net zero situation. So let me just put up a few slides for you. You probably know who this is. I don't know who Paul Valerie is. Express my ignorance, but the future is not what it used to be. I always loved that quote, and if there ever was a moment of this, Hurricane Sandy. This was a day that I was in Beijing, went for a run, and I stopped pretty quickly. And this is the California drought. It is quite striking. And it's not Palo Alto yet. And, you know, the New Yorker always has...
That's our population reduction.
Yeah. And this is not the solution. Then a miracle occurs. Rather, I think these are some of the solutions. Solar is on an amazing trajectory right now, both what we call utility scale and on the bottom, rooftop solar. And look at this growth curve. This was just 2012. We hit 100 gigawatts, 100,000 megawatts. To give you some perspective, a nuclear power plant is about 1,000 megawatts. So we're talking 100,000 megawatts. But I need to be careful. It's confusing. This is capacity, not generation. A nuclear power plant runs basically full time. A solar power plant doesn't because the sun goes down. But this is a lot of power, and that was 2012. Fast forward, and we are closing in on 200,000 megawatts of solar just in the last 2 or 3 years. Look at these wind turbines. See the little guy on top? This is now a relatively small wind turbine. They are growing and growing and growing. And look at 250,000 megawatts at the end of 2012. And we're closing in on 400,000 megawatts of wind. You see that kind of growth just in the last 3 years. It's quite astounding. And, you know, we talk a lot about solar and wind, but energy efficiency, when all is said and done, is the low-hanging fruit. And as I like to say, low-hanging fruit grows back. We're always inventing new energy efficiency technology. So it's not as if we use it up. And one of the great examples is the LED. That light bulb you now have in your house, if you're willing to pay for it, the LEDs in the headlights of your car, they were in the mid-'80s, more than $50 a lumen. That's how we measure the light emittance of an LED. Less than a penny now. That's why they are becoming so ubiquitous. That's why people more and more can actually walk into a hardware store and buy an LED, which uses a tenth the electricity and lasts for 10,000 hours. This may be the most significant development of the last decade, and that is natural gas coming from fracking. Lots of debate about this, but in the US at least, it gets trickier to talk about Europe. We've seen this amazing drop in the price of natural gas from close to $12 a thousand cubic feet to on the order today of about $3 a thousand cubic feet. That's a dramatic drop in the price of a key energy commodity, a key industrial commodity. And that's had fundamental implications for our energy economy in the U.S. And in large parts of the world. So, if the future isn't what it used to be, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And that's what's so exciting about this moment. Yes, we are facing this incredible challenge, this existential challenge of climate change. But what's so exciting is, I think, we've got ways to address it. And this was what's so interesting about this COP, like no other COP that I've been to, Conference of the Parties, is it's the biggest economic opportunity of the 21st century. The International Energy Agency says that we will have to invest more than $38 trillion in energy infrastructure between now and 2035. That's just base level investment just to keep up with demand, to replace old plants. So we can do it not so clean, or we can do it cleanly. And in that hangs the balance between bending the curve, as we say, on carbon emissions, or continuing to increase them and getting ourselves well past that 2 degrees centigrade that everybody talks about. So what's been remarkable at this COP is the interest of the business community, the interest of the investment community in climate change. I was in Copenhagen in 2009. The business community was not engaged. The investment community, the big banks, the pension funds, the sovereign wealth funds, they were nowhere to be seen. Today, this is seen as a major commercial opportunity. And that's been the fundamental change. And when you get the business community engaged in that way, I think it has a very fundamental impact on the politics of these sorts of negotiations. The number that's thrown around these days is that we're spending about $300 billion a year globally in clean energy. What clean energy means, and we could talk a long time about it, but put it in that sort of realm, $250 billion a year. The estimate is that we've got to get to $1 trillion a year being invested in clean energy if we're going to have any shot at staying within this 2 degrees C. So again, big money needed, big money to be made. And to me, this is kind of the answer to the whole thing. If we're going to get to a more sustainable energy future, it's going to be a mix of technology, policy, and finance. We've got to drive a whole set of cleaner technologies in energy, in agriculture, in transportation, in buildings. We've got to drive those forward, and the two key tools for doing that are policy and finance. The technology pipeline, I think you kind of understand. Lots of ideas come in. And at one end, R&D, demonstration, we commercialize it, we deploy it at scale. And there's a lot of companies in this race, more than 10,000 firms right now, across a huge array of sectors: efficiency, power generation, water, waste, fuels, emissions controls, materials, transportation, agriculture, grid infrastructure. Huge number of companies engaged, from very small to very large. Energy finance, that other point on the triangle, you hear a lot about venture capital investment in clean energy. That's the high-risk, early-stage money that goes in to fledgling companies. A few of those make it, not a lot, but those few that do get into what's called growth stage investing, and then ultimately their technology works at scale, and that's where the world of project finance comes in. So on one end is high-risk technologies, low amounts of money. At the other end are lots of money being invested in projects deploying technologies where you're taking the risk out. In between is what we call the valley of death. This is where lots and lots of energy technologies don't make it. For a whole host of reasons. One, technologically, they weren't a smart idea. Secondly, they can't raise the capital they need. Third, there are competitor technologies that work better. Any number of things along the way that push these technologies into the valley of death, out of which they never come. Fracking, again, we can debate fracking, but it took 65 years to cross the valley of death for fracking. lots of technologies had to come together. Some of them coming out of the Pentagon, sonar technology and special drilling and all sorts of things, ways you could look deep underground and see what's going on. All that had to come together. Many billions had to be spent, and it happened that the price of natural gas went up at a key moment. The solar cell. Bell Lab was advertising the solar cell in 1954. And we're barely at 1% global electricity from the sun right now. So it's been a very long slog. The good news is we finally turned the corner. The good news is that the price of solar has come down dramatically, as you saw, and solar deployment is now something real. We built a utility-scale wind turbine. A wind turbine hooked to the electric grid at utility scale. Big turbine got built on a mountain in Vermont in 1941. It operated for 6 months, the blade fell off. It was World War II, they couldn't get any more steel and they shut it down. This was a big deal, but again, it took decades and decades to get this energy technology to scale. But what makes me so optimistic is that it is at scale today. Wind and solar over the last year have been far and away the largest capacity additions to our electricity system globally. And where are we going with wind? Well, we're going into the ocean. Shallow water, putting the turbines on the bottom, and they sit there, going into deeper water, and then ultimately going to floating designs. This is in Denmark. Very shallow water, 10,000 megawatts of these now roughly in Europe. We have none in the United States, but one is under construction. A little project off the coast of Rhode Island. But we have an amazing offshore resource in the United States, and in fact, it's better than the onshore resource in many respects. One of the main reasons is it's close to populations. Our best resource is down the middle of the United States. What you want are those purples and reds. You want to stay away from greens and yellows and browns. And you see where the purples are. They're down the center of the U.S., but populations aren't very big. It's on the coast, though, where we got the best winds. And the reason we're interested in floating turbines is because on the western side of the country, in California, we have no shallow water, but we have a vast, vast wind resource. And it's a resource we desperately need now, not only as a result of climate change, but as a result of a real push in our state legislature in California, a law recently signed by our governor, moving the state to 50% renewables by 2030. So, I think I am going to talk about this for a second, and then we will end. So, policy is the other key to all of this. What is it going to actually take to get these technologies deployed at scale? It's a mix of capital and policy. And the policy in the U.S. goes from very early stage R&D funding provided by the Department of Energy and other agencies to support by the Export-Import Bank, when it was authorized, it is now not authorized any longer, the federal government's own procurement, and the big few are these: fuel economy standards, the Clean Power Plan, and efficiency standards. Fuel economy standards, this is the CAFE requirement. This is what's taking us as a result of a decision made by President Obama and implemented by EPA and the Department of Transportation. It's going to move us from 27.5 miles per gallon to 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025. That's a big deal. That's a very big deal. And that's going to have huge implications for controlling greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And then you may have read about this so-called EPA Clean Power Plan. This is essentially when we couldn't get legislation adopted in the United States Congress to deal with climate change, so-called cap and trade legislation failed, we couldn't get a carbon tax. The EPA went back to its existing authority under the Clean Air Act and said, we probably can regulate these emissions under existing authority. The case went up to the Supreme Court twice. The Supreme Court said, yeah, you do have the authority. EPA's gone ahead, and what the result is this EPA Clean Power Plan, which is essentially putting emissions limits on power plants of all sorts, state by state, and the darker the state, the more they've got to cut because they have a higher proportion of fossil energy in those states, typically a higher proportion of coal-based power plants. And then the little engine that could are the energy efficiency standards that my old agency, the Department of Energy, has been setting for decades. I'll give you one quick example, my favorite example, and that's the lowly refrigerator, which in the early 1970s used almost 2,000 kilowatt hours a year of electricity. As a result of a set of standards adopted by California and the Department of Energy over decades, you can't sell a refrigerator in the U.S. that uses more than 500. And they're bigger, they're frost-free, they talk to you, they provide you water and ice and do all sorts of amazing things. I will end with my greatest moment as a bureaucrat. When I was there, I got to oversee the promulgation, the formal word, of an energy efficiency standard for refrigerators. And we were getting to the day when we were going to announce it. And my then boss, the Secretary of Energy at the time, Bill Richardson, the former governor of New Mexico and UN ambassador, we're getting up at a little press conference. Yeah, you do have press conferences on appliance efficiency standards. You don't get a lot of reporters, but you have them nonetheless. So he gets up and he says, Reicher, what should I get up and say? And I thought to myself, this was 1999, and President Clinton had just given his final State of the Union. And the theme of that State of the Union was our move from one millennium into the next. And he talked about, in his State of the Union, building a bridge to the 21st century. So I said, you know, Mr. Secretary, you ought to get up and announce we're building a bridge to the 21st century. He said, no, you get up and do that. And so we're recording. It was the quote of the week in Newsweek. I was in the bottom at the top. It was my greatest days here.
Thank you. So you are hopeful about renewable energy saving us from our present predicament.
I am hopeful. I am. And I'm also, I should tell you, I'm hopeful about the COP.
Yes, so tell us about that.
Yeah, because we have a pessimist French and optimist American.
You gotta have a range of views. You know, we're playing the COP here. It's Saudi Arabia. What can I say? Oh, it's France.
Well, anyway, tell us your version of the COP.
I'm modestly optimistic, and I think, as I said, I think the gravity of the problem has really hit home to a very large extent. I think there is an increasing sense that we actually have a chance at solving it. And, as I said earlier, I think the commercial world realizes there's money to be made. I honestly believe that's a big, big element of this. You don't have the 5 largest investment banks in the United States, you know, the likes of JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, in the renewable energy business, showing up at these COPs with some of their most senior people. They want this to happen, and I think that's very fundamental. The other difference is we've taken a different approach, I think. The old approach was more, we set targets, we established timetables, we kind of get back together. This has taken a different approach, which is basically, in simple terms, each country comes forward and makes a commitment. Lays on the table what it thinks it can do. And then coming out of this, essentially there will be a monitoring verification process. There's a high level of transparency. We agree to get back together again in a certain amount of time. It's not foolproof. It's not fully binding. But I think we could walk out of here with enough agreement that we're not going to do all we need to do, as Noah says, but I think we'll be part of it.
Thank you. And is that a copy of your report, that red thing, the state one?
Well, yeah, so I brought 3 reports in my
I think, could you just show that?
yeah, so this is a report, Secretary George Shultz, former Secretary of State at the Hoover Institution, and Jeff Bingham, a graduate of Stanford Law School, got together and said, you know, we ought to look, one a Democrat, one a Republican, we ought to look at what the U.S. states are up to. Because there is this sense that it's kind of California and everybody else. But it turns out there's quite an array of U.S. states, and not just blue states, but even some red states, that are actually taking some significant steps in clean energy. And so we wrote a report, basically we call it the Clean Energy Cookbook. And it's looking at what individual states are doing and saying, you know, politically, across the board, we know how to get this done. This was a report we put out last week that compares 3 large countries and what they're doing in renewables. Those countries are Germany, California, and Texas. The 12 largest economies in the world with radically different politics, and each one has succeeded in very different ways at deploying renewable energy. The Texans often don't like to admit it, but they are far and away the biggest wind production state in the United States. And they've had a tremendous success with wind in the state of Texas, but most people don't know that. So, and this last one, you got 30 seconds.
Yes, we have a brilliant Stanford, Oxford student, well, former student, who was co-authored with Dr. Reicher.
Reach for the Sun.
Maroon,
you get 30 seconds.
Yeah, I would like to ask Maroon to say where he works with the mayor of New York on improving all the, he's advising the top people in the U.S. So this is to the solar in India.
Thank you, and that was a great line, Dan. A bridge to the 21st century. Dan and I and our co-author Girish Srimali at the Climate Policy Initiative and a fellow at the Sarah Taylor Center wrote this report on India's audacious solar ambition. About a year ago, Prime Minister Modi, the incoming Prime Minister, announced that India wanted to reach 100 gigawatts of solar.
100,000 megawatts.
100,000 megawatts. That was kind of laughable because that was more than half of all the solar that was in the entire world. And he wanted to do it in 7 years. Increasing the solar in India by more than 20 times. So Dan and I and our co-author dug into the numbers and found out that in fact solar has dropped in price in India faster than almost any country in the world, and that the potential not only for large solar parks but also for rooftop solar and off-grid solar that increase energy access, the potential for all of these is tremendous. And if India does the right policy things and it gets the right source of international assistance, it's not only going to reduce its emissions from coal power plants, it's also going to secure a range of domestic benefits for its own sustainable development, from reducing air pollution to increasing energy access to increasing the number of jobs, sustainable jobs in India. So we put this report out hoping to say that India is in fact an ambitious player, that they're doing a lot to make sure that these climate talks come to a successful accord, and the world should see it as a global priority to help them out.
Great.